181. Hermione, who can no longer bear it. Scott ignored the looks of the others. They stared at him as if he were mad. He kept asking Luna, "Have you thought of a way, Luna?" Luna sat down beside him without a word, chin in her hands, and continued to watch Neville. Neville's face was frozen, only his eyes darting around like they were sending out silent pleas for help. Seeing his bewildered expression, Scott gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said softly. "It'll be all right soon." "How can you say that? That's impossible," Ron blurted. Scott watched him approach, his face screwed up. "What's wrong?" he asked. Luna looked up at Ron, startled. "From what you're saying, I can only think of one possibility." She hesitated, then added quietly, "A part of Neville's subconscious believes magic can hurt people." Ron frowned and bent over Neville, patting his shoulder. "I can promise you Neville is definitely not an obscurial," he said loudly. "I don't have an obscurus," Neville echoed, his voice thin. "Obscurus? What's that?" Harry asked, curious. "I know." Hermione jumped in immediately. She lifted her chin and recited from memory, "When young witches and wizards are forced to suppress their magic through physical or psychological abuse, they can produce a dark parasitic force called an obscurus. The child becomes an obscurial. When an obscurial's emotions and mind break down, they lose control, and the obscurus bursts out, causing a terrifying storm," Ron continued, his face going pale at the thought. "In extreme cases, the obscurial's body can even become an obscurus." He swallowed and patted Neville again. "But Neville, you're not an obscurial. They're very rare, and most don't live past 10. "There's such a thing?" Harry's eyes widened. "Sounds awful." He looked unsettled, as if remembering something unpleasant. "I feel lucky I didn't become one," he added indignantly. Scott glanced at Harry. Given what Harry had been through, his relief made sense. But the focus had to be Neville. "Neville isn't an obscurial," Scott said firmly. "He's never been forced to suppress his magic." He looked at Neville. "If anything, your family always wanted your magic to be stronger, didn't they?" Neville nodded, still trembling. "My family pushed me to bring out my magic." "Then it's not an obscurus," Scott said. "It's psychological, subconscious resistance. A part of him believes magic is dangerous, maybe from past experiences, or just because he's too kind. He's unconsciously fighting against his own power." Fred and George leaned in, grinning. "You weren't saying that to Luna just now, were you?" Fred teased. Luna's eyes were unfocused, as if she were half in another world. Scott didn't shrink away from her presence. "This is Luna's way of saying it," he went on. "Luna sees people's emotions as creatures. If someone's troubled, she might call it a Sorao Meng invading their mind." "Sorao Meng?" Fred asked, leaning toward Luna. "Do I have one in my head?" Luna glanced at him. "No." Then she turned back to Scott, serious. "Sorao Meng are real." "I'm not denying that," Scott said with a smile. "I can't see them, so I don't claim to know, but right now we should explain things in a way everyone can accept." He gave Luna a quick wink and addressed the others. "Whether you call them Sorao Meng or something else, Luna just experiences the world differently." Hermione, who had been on the verge of action, paused. Scott felt a quiet relief. He didn't want to get into a debate with her today. Luna suddenly pointed at Neville and exclaimed, "He needs to open the door and let the seed inside him sprout and grow." Neville gaped, utterly confused. The others exchanged puzzled looks. Scott felt a little helpless. Luna's manner often made people dismiss her as odd, but she simply had another way of seeing things, and Scott understood. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he said. He watched the reactions around him, the twins and Eddie treating it like an amusing performance, Harry and Ron bewildered but hesitant to speak up, and Hermione's distrust almost visibly rising. She looked like she wanted to object, but was holding herself back. Scott stood. "All right, let's try it, Neville." He motioned for Neville to stand. "Okay." Neville rose reluctantly, like a bullied, pitiful child. Scott drew his wand and pointed it at Neville's chest. "No! What are you doing?" Hermione finally snapped, having reached her limit. She stepped forward. "Wait!" The twins moved to stop her. "Get out of the way!" Hermione drew her wand, pointing it at them, eyes wide. "I get it. You're just bullying Neville." "Neville," he said weakly. "I'm all right." "Don't be afraid, Neville," Hermione cried, righteous. "We'll help you." She turned to Harry and Ron. "Harry, Ron, you agree, right?" Both of them, still a bit lost, nodded automatically. "I can't believe this," Hermione said, glaring at Scott. I didn't expect you to do something like this. Scott's expression was calm. He flicked his wand. Petrificus Talus. A jet of light struck Hermione, and she instantly stiffened, her eyes wide. Be quiet for a bit, Hermione, Scott said. I won't hurt Neville. I just need you all to watch. 182. A phenomenon similar to a magic riot, Scott's sudden movement seemed to startle everyone. Neville especially stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. Hermione, he gasped. Harry and Ron were equally dumbfounded. That's so like you, Scott, Fred said with a grin. Now you're in for it. Our little McGonagall won't let you off, George added, laughing. All right, everyone, quiet down. Scott turned and smiled at them, and they fell silent. He tapped Neville's chest with the tip of his wand. Calm down, Neville, he said, his voice softening. Trust me, just follow my instructions. Neville looked up at him. Something in his expression shifted, and his breathing slowed. Close your eyes, Scott murmured. Neville obediently shut his eyes. You really like plants, don't you? Scott asked gently. Neville hummed. What's your favorite plant? Scott continued. Neville thought a moment. Rue. Rue, Scott said, approvingly. It dispels many poisons, a very useful herb. Neville managed a faint smile. Clear your mind, Neville. Scott waved his wand slowly. Imagine you're a rue seed buried in pitch-black soil. A faint charm light wrapped Neville, and his expression began to change with Scott's voice. His eyes remained shut, brows knitting. His body curled slightly, as if compressed by the earth. Slowly, you sprout, you push through the soil. Scott's tone turned coaxing. You grow day by day. Neville's face shifted to match the words. Under the moonlight, dew on your leaves reflects a silver glow. Scott let his magic swell. The hem of his robe lifted, and his wand pressed again against Neville's chest. You've grown, but you can't flower, only green leaves. The other rues mock you. You're different. Neville's features tightened with frustration. Scott's robe began to ripple. He continued, You grow a little more, but you live in a flower pot in a greenhouse. Neville writhed slightly. Life in the greenhouse is safe. You're protected layer by layer, kept from wind and rain. You don't want that, Scott sighed. This isn't the real world. You think hiding here is why you can't bloom. You want to feel real sun and rain. Neville's face became anxious. Is there any way? Then grow, Scott said. Keep growing. Neville made a struggling motion. Grow. Keep growing. Time passes, Scott went on, his voice quietly intensifying. You grow bigger and bigger, taller than the other rues. You become different. At that moment, the owner of the greenhouse arrives. Scott's voice shifted, mocking surprise. How can there be an oak sapling here? He said, feigning confusion. It's then you realize, you're not a rue, you're an oak. You are a tall oak, Scott said, louder. How can you grow in a low greenhouse, root in a small pot? Oaks belong in the forest. To become towering, you must break free from this cage. The tip of Scott's wand flared. Both his and Neville's robes and hair lifted as if in a gust. Grow, oak tree. Let your trunk and roots shatter the pot and the greenhouse. Let sun and rain have you. The glow at his wand tip brightened. Neville thrashed as if fighting to break free. Do you hear it? The pot cracking, the greenhouse glass shattering, Scott shouted. You will be a tall oak, standing firm in a raging storm. Ah! Neville suddenly let out a cry. Then every desk and chair in the classroom began to rise slowly. Curtains billowed and slapped against the windows. This is... Harry's voice was strained with shock. A magic riot? Ron couldn't believe it either. At that moment, Scott lowered his wand. The hem of his robe fell, and he stepped back, watching Neville float amid the levitating furniture. It isn't a true magic riot, Scott said. It's Neville's magic, fluctuating at a frequency we've never seen, creating something very like one. You did it! Luna came and stood beside Scott, delighted. The oak took root in his heart and grew, and it chased away that creature of fear. Scott nodded, pleased. That's right, it worked. Luna sounded a little sad. It's a pity the creature died after leaving his mind. Yes, Scott agreed casually. Amazing, though. Eddie darted up to him. How did you do that, Scott? I'll explain later, Scott said, still watching Neville. Oh, do you think Neville's going to become brilliant now? Fred and George looked at Neville with curiosity. Do it on us, Scott, Fred urged. Me too, George shouted. Fred thrust his hand up behind them. Scott spread his hands helplessly. I can't. Your minds are already too open, full of uncontrolled bludgers. Just then Neville's eyes flew open. Ah! He came crashing down along with the tumbling desks and chairs, making a loud racket. Fred exclaimed, "Now Professor might come running." "Let's move," Scott said and helped Neville scramble up. "How do you feel?" I'm fine," Neville stammered as he pushed himself to his feet. "I don't know what happened, but I feel very good." "Let's go. Get out before the professor arrives." Scott led the way to the door. He paused and looked at Hermione, who was still frozen where she'd been hit with the bodybind curse. "Sorry," he flicked his wand. "Finite incantatem." The Petrificus Totalis on Hermione released. She glared at Scott, eyes reddened, lips trembling with anger. "Hurry up!" The twins had already opened the classroom door and slipped out. Scott didn't waste any more words. He motioned for Neville and Luna, and they followed him out of the room. A crowd poured out of the classroom, led by the Weasley twins, and hurried across the castle grounds toward the Quidditch pitch. Scott glanced back at Neville, meaning for him to try a charm, but Neville was panting hard. He'd have to wait until he'd caught his breath. Scott stepped in front of Hermione. Her face was pale, and her eyes rimmed red, but she had followed them anyway. "I'm sorry, Hermione," Scott said. "I took the liberty of acting first. Explaining would have been a nightmare." His apology was half a performance. It was a convenient way to give the stubborn girl an out. "I know." Hermione's expression was wounded. "I was the one who jumped to conclusions," she said in a muffled voice. Her effort to swallow her anger and be reasonable almost made Scott laugh out loud. He glanced at Harry and Ron. They were trying not to grin. He kept his composure. "It's good you're not angry," Scott said deliberately. "Honestly, it's rare to find a girl as reasonable as you." Hermione's face went even stranger. Her suppressed irritation tightened. Of course, she drew a deep breath and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just don't do this next time. If you'd said what you planned, of course I would have listened. I am very reasonable." She couldn't help retorting. Scott thought, "You're fierce, Miss Granger," but outwardly he still smiled and agreed. "You're right. It was my fault. I'll be more careful. Forgive me this once." "I wasn't blaming you to begin with," Hermione said loftily. Scott gave her a thumbs up. Harry and Ron copied him from behind her. With Hermione placated, Scott turned to Neville. "Feeling rested, Neville?" Neville nodded, still a little shaky. "Yes." "Then give it a try," Scott said. "Cast any charm. See if you've improved." Neville swallowed and nodded again. He pulled out his wand and raised it. "Engorgement charm." A jet of light hit a patch of lawn. In seconds, the grass around the beam swelled wildly, blades several times their normal size. It worked. Neville stared at the oversized grass, disbelief written on his face. "I did it!" Harry and Ron cheered. "That's the engorgement charm we learned this semester. You did it!" Neville ran to touch the swollen blades, eyes shining. The others crowded around, Hermione and Ron joining in their congratulations. Neville's eyes filled with tears. He jumped and cried, "Thank you, Scott," then bowed solemnly. "I'll write to my Gran. She'll be so grateful." Scott patted his shoulder. "No, thank you. You just showed me more of what a wizard can do." "No." Neville shook his head, too overwhelmed to say more. "Come on, tell us how you did it," one of the twins, Eddie, demanded impatiently. "We want details." Fred and George looked at Scott expectantly. He stroked his chin and grinned. "Well, it's all down to amazing magic." Then he turned and ran. "Stop!" someone yelled. "Explain yourself." They were stunned for a moment, then gave chase. Scott ducked into the castle and, using the Marauder's map he hadn't yet returned to the twins, managed to shake them off. To be safe, he ate dinner alone in the kitchens that night. It wasn't until evening that Eddie cornered him in the dormitory. "There's definitely something fishy about this," Eddie said, staring at Scott. "It's good that you noticed." Scott replied with a smile. "Really?" "Of course." Scott leaned back on the bed. "Some things lose their power the moment you put them into words." Eddie squinted, then grinned. "As long as Neville doesn't find out, I can keep quiet." "You?" Scott said, shaking his head. "A big mouth like yours isn't cut out for secrets." "That's slander. My mouth is the tightest in the whole school." Eddie stamped his foot in mock indignation. All right, I'll tell you," Scott said. He knew Eddie loved a secret, but wouldn't betray it. "What do you mean?" Eddie asked. Scott explained calmly. I used a subtle illusion charm and some carefully chosen words to help Neville remove the mental block in his imagination, like what Muggle psychologists do. At the same time, I shifted my own magical frequencies to nudge his magic into activity. I eased the gloom in his head while guiding his magic to respond. Eddie nodded slowly. So only someone who can sense magical fluctuations could do that? Exactly, Scott shrugged. It wasn't miraculous. Neville's main problem was psychological, lack of confidence. Magic needs belief. Charms require inner conviction as much as correct wand movement. So your treatment just gave him the confidence boost he needed? Scott smiled. Yes, it made his magic a bit more active, but it wouldn't instantly let him cast charms he never could. It's the confidence that did most of the work. Eddie's interest faded a little at that. So it was basically a pep talk with a bit of magic. Pretty much, Scott nodded, and I'm careful about telling him that. If he overthinks it, he could start doubting himself again. Eddie looked at him with a new respect. I didn't expect you to be so considerate. Of course, Scott said, smiling. I'm a wonderful person who likes to help others. After Sunday lunch, as Scott left the Great Hall, Jacob called after him. Scott. Jacob smiled and waggled 2 fingers, some kind of signal he'd picked up in Transfiguration class. I understand. Scott nodded, said hello to his roommates, and went with Jacob to an empty classroom. How's your practice with the method I showed you earlier? Scott sat first. It's coming along, Jacob admitted, slowly. Scott sat opposite him. If it's slow, it's okay. You're only in first year Hanwha. You're still in a period of rapid growth. Jacob smiled but looked determined. I know, but one slow step makes every step slow after that. I have to try my best. Scott agreed. Then, looking at Jacob more closely, he said, Actually, your talent isn't bad. From a magical perspective, you're probably around average. Average, Jacob repeated, unconvinced. That's not good enough. Scott shrugged. Then you'll have to work for it. Jacob took out paper and a pen and began asking questions about Transfiguration. Scott answered patiently. He intended to keep his promise. When Jacob finished, Scott glanced at his pocket watch. There was still time left of the 2 hours they'd agreed on. Jacob put away his notebook. Can I ask you something unrelated to Transfiguration? You can, Scott said, but I might not answer everything. Jacob nodded. I heard about what happened yesterday, he said, looking at Scott. Gryffindor's been talking. Someone said you helped Neville increase his magic. So that's how the news had spread. Scott smiled faintly. People are well informed, he said. Jacob brightened. Some people think it's just boasting, but I thought maybe it was true. It is true, Scott said. He watched Jacob's eyes light up, then added, but it's not quite right to say I increased his magic. I released it. Released? Jacob frowned. Scott explained Neville's situation briefly. His problem was psychological. It was a special case, not a general increase in power. Jacob's face fell a little. I thought, you think too highly of me, Scott, half amused. Jacob's expression changed to something resolute. I want to try. Scott blinked. Try what? I want to try, Jacob repeated seriously. Even if it's not the same situation as Neville's, even a little progress would be great. That's not the same thing, Scott said, and even then, I might not be able to do it on you. He studied Jacob. Someone with your willpower wouldn't be easily affected by a confundus charm, and you wouldn't easily open your mind. My kind of influence probably wouldn't guide your magic. I can, Jacob insisted. Scott was genuinely surprised. He looked Jacob over, still doubtful. I don't think so. Jacob frowned. After everything that's happened, haven't you figured me out yet? Scott didn't follow at first. Jacob continued, speaking with quiet conviction. I've shown my position. I'm willing to follow you. I'll look to you as my leader. Scott stiffened. He had no desire to be anyone's leader of a group. We're not trying to start an organization, he said flatly. Our backgrounds and positions are similar, Jacob went on. If you're worried, we can make a contract. Stop, Scott held up his hand. If you want to try, then try. It's fine. No contract. No contract? Jacob's face lit up. Really? Yes, really. Scott was a little exasperated. Do you have the wrong idea about me? I'm not trying to form a group. But there already seem to be a lot of people around you. Jacob looked pleased and started listing names. Your roommates, of course. The Weasley twins, Cedric Diggory, Luna Lovegood, and Neville, who you helped yesterday. Oh, and even the Savior and his two friends get along with you. Scott rubbed his forehead. He hadn't realized Jacob had come to such conclusions so quickly. I'm not Travers, he said with a dark expression. Those people I mentioned are my friends. Is that so? Jacob nodded, as if he understood. Good. Scott smiled, then Jacob added eagerly, I can be your friend too. Scott felt baffled. That's exactly the point. No, you don't understand, Scott said, trying to be clear. He leaned forward. I mean real friends, literal friendships. No hidden meanings, no secret agendas. Do you understand? Jacob stared blankly for a moment. Scott realized he still wasn't getting it. The kid was tense and on edge. Scott reached out and patted his shoulder. Relax, kid. Seeing Jacob look a bit lost and helpless made Scott think back to the first time he'd met him last semester. He remembered a smaller boy who would curl up on the sofa and cry. The tough exterior Jacob wore now, layers of wariness and sharp edges, had been put on to protect that hurt child. Because of your bad luck, Scott said softly, everything you encountered when you first came into the magical world was unpleasant. Those things forced you to harden yourself to protect yourself and your family. But don't let them change how you judge everything. He looked at Jacob earnestly. There are dangers here, and there are scumbags, but there are also good people and good things. This place gives you the chance to learn amazing magic and to make true friends. True friends? Jacob repeated, his voice small, eyes already shining with tears. Scott felt something like pity and warmth at once. The boy was only 11. The frightened child was still there under the armor. He had just hidden himself behind illusions and a sharp shell. 185. About how to use the diadem. You should really think about it, Jacob, Scott said. Come find me when you've decided. I won't go back on my word. He stood, waved his hand casually, and left the classroom. As the door closed, he heard suppressed sobs from inside. Scott shook his head. This felt more like an 11-year-old. We're still at an age where we celebrate Children's Day. To be honest, Scott didn't want to see another Travers. Even though he himself was a fake youth with memories from a previous life, seeing other children act overly mature and worldly still made him uneasy. Monday evening arrived quickly. Scott received a notice and went to Professor Flitwick's office. Good evening, Professor, he said, taking a seat on the sofa. You're here, Scott. Flitwick jumped up from his chair behind the desk, fidgeting with excitement as he paced the office. Rowena Ravenclaw has scheduled an audience for today. He added under his breath, once Albus arrives, we'll go together. All right. Scott kept his composure, but inside he was a little excited, not because of the diadem itself, but because this meant he had completed both of Rowena Ravenclaw's tasks, and it was time to collect his reward, a magical portrait containing most of Rowena Ravenclaw's knowledge to serve as his exclusive, full-time professor. That was far more valuable to him than the diadem. No matter how magical the diadem, it was an artifact. Its symbolic value had long since eclipsed its practical worth. In any case, the diadem would ultimately belong to Ravenclaw House. Since it couldn't be his, he didn't covet it. He was already imagining the rare knowledge he might learn from Rowena. A soft knock sounded. Flitwick hurried to the door. Oh, Albus, you're here! Dumbledore smiled as he entered. Good evening, Phileas Scott. Let us go. The three walked through several corridors and arrived at the room of requirement. Scott opened Helena's study. Good evening, he said. In the painting, Helena smiled at them. You've come at just the right time. Mother has already purified the diadem. The inner door manifested. Helena vanished from the portrait, and then, from within the doorway, called, Please come in. Dumbledore stepped aside and gestured for Professor Flitwick to enter first. Flitwick straightened his tie and robes, then solemnly pushed the door open. Scott and Dumbledore followed. The inner room was sparse, portraits of Ravenclaw and Helena on the walls, and the diadem resting on the floor. The moment they entered, their eyes were drawn to it. The diadem shone with renewed radiance. Good evening, Rowena Ravenclaw said from her portrait, smiling at the three of them. As you can see, the diadem has been restored to its original form. Flitwick recovered his composure and bowed deeply to the portrait. Good evening, esteemed Rowena Ravenclaw. Scott followed suit. No need for so many formalities, Ravenclaw replied softly. From now on, the diadem will be kept in Ravenclaw House, and the dean of the house will be responsible for its safekeeping. This, Flitwick could hardly contain his excitement. This is your artifact. Rowena shook her head. I no longer need it for myself. Let it remain in the house to aid any child who requires assistance. How it is used should be decided by you, the dean. She looked at Dumbledore. What do you say, Principal? Of course, Dumbledore said. Everything will follow your arrangements, Rowena. Then take it and be gone. Rowena fell silent, watching as Flitwick hurried to the center of the room, knelt, and carefully lifted the diadem with both hands. Scott wanted to bring up his own concern, but Rowena didn't mention it, so he held his tongue for now. As the last person to leave the inner room, he glanced back. Rowena winked at him. Scott felt a surge of confidence. He would return alone when no one else was around. Back in Flitwick's office, the dean placed the diadem on the desk atop a cushion of soft blue velvet. Dumbledore studied it for a moment, then asked, Phileas, how will you handle this? Word will spread, and many will be curious about the diadem. Flitwick straightened, every bit the protector. I will guard it well. No one but Ravenclaw's students will be allowed access to this treasure. I trust you, Dumbledore said, and I will support you if there is external pressure. Thank you, Albus, Flitwick replied gratefully. Dumbledore's expression grew serious. But you must be careful about how it is used. It's not entirely beneficial for students to be casually interacting with an artifact that increases wisdom. Flitwick frowned. Why not? Dumbledore folded his hands. There are always students who will seek quick advantages, potions before exams, charms, anything that promises extra performance. We cannot let students become dependent on a magical object like the diadem. That would do them no lasting good. Flitwick nodded earnestly. You're right. I must be cautious. He thought for a moment. I will announce that only students who show mature minds and exemplary conduct may apply to use it. Dumbledore added, it must be used under your supervision and never leave your office. Of course, Flitwick agreed. I will set the specific rules. After all, I am the Dean of Ravenclaw. Dumbledore had one more thing to say, then bid them farewell and left. The instant he was gone, Flitwick's excitement returned. Oh, the legend says the diadem increases wisdom. It's unimaginable. He moved around the desk, peering at the diadem like a child. I think we should both try it, Scott. For a moment, the solemn dean behaved like an eager child. You try it first, Scott said to Professor Flitwick. Let's see if this diadem is as magical as the legends say. I try it? Flitwick stopped pacing and looked at him. Of course, Scott said with a smile. You're the most suitable person. All right, then. Flitwick nimbly climbed onto a chair, picked up the diadem, and went to place it on his head. Oh, he stopped, hand on his wizard's hat. I forgot to take my hat off. He set the diadem down, removed his hat, then picked the diadem up again with a solemn expression and carefully settled it on his head. Oh, his eyes widened. How is it, Professor? Scott asked, curious. It's wonderful, Flitwick murmured. Absolutely wonderful. He snatched up a quill, pulled a sheet of parchment toward him, and began to write so quickly it was almost a blur. Oh, I'm sorry, Scott, he said as his hand moved. The diadem seems to have made my mind several times more active. Everything I've learned can be recalled instantly. His voice dropped to a whisper. Difficult problems I couldn't solve before. I suddenly understand them. I must record this. When he finished, he looked exhausted and frown creased his brow. I must take it off. He set the diadem back on the desk. What's wrong? Scott asked. Using the diadem comes at a cost, Flitwick said, studying it. The deeper and more complex the thought it helps you reach, the more mentally draining it is. You get exhausted faster. That makes sense, Scott said. It's actually reassuring. It means it helps at critical moments but prevents constant dependence. You're right. Flitwick smiled and beckoned him. Come on, Scott. You had the biggest hand in finding this. You should try it. My pleasure. Scott took the diadem in both hands and examined it. It was ornate, eagle-shaped, set with large, sparkling blue sapphires, beautiful, but not exactly fashionable for a young gentleman. He pushed the thought aside and lifted the diadem to his head. A cool sensation crept into his skull, not unpleasant so much as startlingly fresh. His thoughts snapped to attention. He began to think about a course he'd been struggling with, combination charm casting. The pieces of information he already had rose to the surface and began to knit together with astonishing speed. Where he'd hit walls before, ideas now flowed and folded into each other. One by one, the problems that had stalled his progress gave way. When a dull throbbing began at the base of his skull, he removed the diadem and sat back. The intense burst of insight had felt like days of study compressed into minutes, provided the learning process could move smoothly without getting stuck. "It really is magical," he said, returning the diadem to the desk. "It's a bit frightening. This thing is too tempting for Ravenclaw." "I agree," Flitwick nodded. "We'll have to be very careful about how to use it." "You need a proper system," Scott said bluntly. Or, he smiled, "Forgive my bluntness, but Ravenclaws can be quite reckless." Flitwick returned the smile. "I'm a Ravenclaw myself. I'll be using most of my willpower to keep my own greed at bay." "You're already a Ravenclaw with a strong moral compass," Scott said. Flitwick sighed and shook his head. "Sometimes I forget you're only 14, Scott. You've got an old head on young shoulders." "Perhaps that comes from my family," Scott replied casually. "Our background is complicated." Flitwick nodded. Then, almost conversationally, he said, "One thing I'm grateful for. Ravenclaws generally don't hunger for power." Scott laughed. "You've thought about that too?" "If Ravenclaw were as eager for power as Slytherin," Flitwick's face went serious, "that would be terrifying. I don't mean to disparage Slytherin. Some of them are very capable, but Ravenclaw can play far subtler games." Scott laughed again. He didn't know much about Slytherins of the distant past, and the Slytherins he'd met lately were more straightforward, perhaps shaped by the pure-blood ideology. The most cunning Slytherin he'd encountered was Snape, and even Snape didn't seem like the sort of old-school mastermind he imagined. The truly dangerous sort of Slytherin would be someone like Medea, mysterious even now, like a shape seen through fog. They chatted a while longer, practiced charms together, then used the secret passage in Flitwick's office to return to Ravenclaw Tower. Before Scott left, Flitwick asked him to keep the diadem a secret until he'd worked out how best to handle it. Scott agreed. Back in the common room, Jacob called him over. Scott sat across from him on a corner sofa and watched. "Good evening, Scott." "Good evening." Scott studied Jacob. "You've changed a bit. You have me to thank." Jacob seemed livelier than before. "I thought about what you said for a long time. You were right. When I looked at things differently, I got different responses." Scott nodded. Jacob smiled, a little self-deprecating. "I used to be too insecure. I've started getting to know my classmates again. There aren't that many bad guys after all." Scott looked into Jacob's eyes and, sensing the quiet pulse of magic there, knew he wasn't lying. A relieved smile crossed his face. "Maybe I do have a knack for mouth foo," he thought, feeling oddly pleased with himself. "It's good you can think like that," he said. "If you're always suspicious and only deal with people for what you can get from them, where's the joy in living?" Jacob exhaled a long breath and sank back on the sofa, letting himself relax. "Thanks, Scott." He tilted his head to watch the star-speckled dome of the common room. His voice sounded distant. "I feel so much lighter, like winter's over, and I've finally taken off a heavy coat." Scott smiled. "Keeping yourself wound up all the time isn't small potatoes. Don't let yourself age before your time." "Scott, Jacob." Luna shuffled over in a pair of slippers and flopped onto the next couch, peering at them with bright curiosity. "What are you two talking about?" She blinked, then leaned forward and fixed her gaze on Jacob. "Jacob," she said in a wavering voice, "who helped you drive away the Sorau Meng?" "Sorau Meng," Jacob frowned. Scott, reclined on the sofa, chuckled. "She means your gloomy cloud of emotions has eased up." Luna cocked her head. "Is that how I'm supposed to say it?" "You can try to explain it in a way others understand," Scott suggested. Luna thought a moment, then shook her head. "But I don't want to lie." "Then don't," Scott said. "You don't have to change who you are for anyone." She clapped her hands delightedly and laughed, small and bright. A few seconds later, the laugh faded, and she produced a copy of the Quibbler from her knitted satchel, settling down to read as if nothing else had happened. Scott turned to Jacob, who still looked a little bewildered, and shrugged. Jacob pursed his lips and began to talk over the things troubling him in his studies. Scott could tell he'd been nervous. After a patient explanation, Jacob visibly relaxed. As curfew neared, Jacob hesitated and asked one last question. If when I first booked those 3 Transfiguration sessions with you, if I'd asked for help like this, then would you have answered me? Scott considered it. Maybe, he said, but not with the same patience as now. Why? Jacob asked. Think about how you acted the day you first met me, Scott said with a smile. I'd have been less inclined to be friendly to that version of you. Jacob shrugged, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. No wonder you kept your distance. You should drop the maybe, Scott said. Be more confident. The next morning, Scott was up before anyone else. While the castle still slept, he went to the corridor that led to the room of requirement. Murmuring Helena's study as he paced the passage 3 times, the familiar door at last presented itself. The eagle-shaped knocker blinked and regarded him. Oh, it's you, the knocker said. Go in. Thanks. Scott pushed the door and slipped inside, closing it behind him. Good morning, Scott. Helena's voice came from the portrait in the study. Good morning, Helena. Scott stood a moment, looking at her painted face. Will you be in the painting from now on? For the time being, she answered. My presence there is my mother's magic. When my mother departs, I will return. Scott's eyebrows rose. You'll come back? I thought. You thought that once a ghost had no lingering regrets, they would simply leave? Helena smiled sadly. I know why you'd think that, but I cannot do that. I am the ghost of Ravenclaw. My presence has a purpose. I would like to embrace death, as you say, but I cannot yet. Scott remembered the magic Dumbledore had used when he had tried to bind Medea and asked flatly, Is it because of that binding? That is only part of it. Helena said, The ghosts of each house have a role to play here. She hesitated, then added, You might have heard of Myrtle. Moaning Myrtle? Scott nodded. Helena sighed. I thought, at one point, to put her forward in my stead, but her temperament, she's not suited to it. Scott couldn't help laughing a little at the image of Myrtle representing Ravenclaw. Helena returned the smile and slipped into the large landscape painting that hung beside her. As she moved, a small door opened in the frame. Go on, she urged, and then she was gone. Scott pushed through the newly formed door into the painted room. Good morning, he said aloud. Professor Ravenclaw. Good morning. The woman in the portrait inclined her head, smiling with something like novelty. It has been a long time since a child called me professor. From now on, you'll be my professor, Scott answered. I was promised. My promise stands. Ravenclaw's smile softened. Then she grew serious. I let you in today because I feared you might be troubled, and I wish to show you that I will not break my word. Scott opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand and stopped him. You may leave now, she said gently. Do not interrupt the time my daughter and I have. She looked toward the other portrait frame with tenderness in her eyes. Scott's stomach tightened at her words. He realized she had only a limited time to be here. Ravenclaw met his gaze again. When Helena returns to Ravenclaw Tower, she will bring you here once more. That will be when my true portrait remains. I understand. Scott bowed, respect and something like sorrow in his voice. Professor Ravenclaw. He left quietly, closing the painted door behind him. 188. Never miss any opportunity. After lunch, Scott and Jacob returned to an empty classroom. This time, Scott had deliberately picked one without desks or chairs. To be honest, I'm curious, he admitted. Scott looked at Jacob. As a normal wizard, I want to see whether my magic fluctuations can coax yours into resonating. If it works, what happens? Jacob smiled. It can't be worse than it is now. Scott warned him, be prepared. Even in the best case, this will only make your magic a little more active. He knew well that this wouldn't strengthen Jacob's magic or change his innate talent. Many factors affect a wizard's ability to cast charms, and fluctuation activity is only one small part. Jacob nodded. I want to try, he said. Please, Scott? Okay. Scott took out his wand and pressed the tip against Jacob's chest. Open your mind, he said. You have to trust me completely for this to work. All right. Jacob closed his eyes. The hem of Scott's robe fluttered, and the wand tip began to glow faintly. Bang! A muffled thump. Jacob was shoved back several steps and ended up sitting on the floor. It didn't work, he breathed. Scott lowered his wand and frowned. Are you all right? He went to Jacob. You didn't open your mind. I could feel your magic resisting mine. I'm fine. Jacob pushed himself up slowly, pale and clutching his chest. I'm not hurt, just a bit sore. He gave an apologetic smile. Sorry, I didn't mean to distrust you. Scott waved him quiet. It's your subconscious. You can't just choose to override that. Try again, Jacob said, putting a hand to his chest. One more time. Scott frowned. I'm not convinced it's a good idea. If you're not confident, we should stop. If we keep going like this, you'll just hurt yourself. It's okay. Jacob fished a potion from his pocket, tilted his head back, and drained it. He stuck the empty glass away and wiped his mouth. One more time, please. Scott stared at him for a long moment, then relented. One more time, he said. He pressed the wand to Jacob's chest again. The glow returned, and Scott kept the power low at first, letting it build slowly. Jacob closed his eyes. Under Scott's guidance, Jacob's magic began to stir and strengthen. For a moment it looked promising, then, just as their frequencies neared each other, Jacob's magic pushed back. It was far weaker than Scott's, so Jacob was thrown backwards again with another dull thud. He clutched his chest and collapsed to the floor. Scott put his wand away and looked down at him. I think we should give up. Jacob's expression fell. Scott softened. Honestly, if I were in your position, I don't think I'd be able to open my mind to someone else either. Jacob tried to answer, but gagged and pulled another potion from his pocket, drinking it quickly. This isn't worth getting injured over, Scott said. Phew. Jacob exhaled and stood again. Last time. He looked at Scott with pleading eyes. Scott smiled despite himself. You really are something. He sounded a little helpless. I know this won't make you much stronger. It just might make you feel a little less insecure. Jacob's voice dropped. I don't want to be just an ordinary wizard. I want to achieve things. I want to learn more magic. I don't want to miss any opportunity. Scott found something familiar in that look, ambition he'd seen before. He set a firm condition. If it doesn't work this time, I won't try it again. Okay, Jacob agreed. Scott raised his wand. The tip glowed and he closed his eyes, relying on sensation alone. He eased his own suppressed fluctuations outward, guiding them toward Jacob's. As Jacob's frequency slowly rose, Scott put more and more of himself into the connection. This time there was no repulsion. Jacob's magic began to sink and grow more active under Scott's influence. The light on the wand brightened, both their robes fluttered in the air. Jacob's eyes were still closed, his face blank, but the change was real, though nothing like the chaos Scott had once seen with Neville. Scott was surprised at how much Jacob could respond. He had told himself he wouldn't open like this normally. After a while, when Jacob's frequency stabilized, Scott eased back and withdrew his hand. Jacob's fluctuations dipped slightly at the moment of release, but quickly steadied again. That was good. It was an improvement over where he had been. After a few breaths, Jacob opened his eyes. How is it? Scott asked. Jacob shook his head, pulled out his wand, and aimed at an empty spot. Incendio! Flames burst from the tip of his wand. Jacob's face lit up. Thank you, Scott, he said, thrilled. I can feel it. Casting charms is a bit smoother now. Is it that noticeable? Scott asked, skeptical but pleased. Just a little, Jacob admitted, smiling, but it's worth it. Sorry, only these 2 updates today, for tomorrow. Chapter 189. Toy fireplace and land night fell, and Scott stood alone on the top floor of the astronomy tower. A dark shape cut across the sky and hurtled toward him at a reckless speed. It was Lambo, returning right on time. Scott stretched out his arm. As the bird dove in, its speed slowed. Its broad wings beat the air, ruffling Scott's hair. Good evening, my friend, Lambo called as it settled onto his arm. Good evening, Scott replied, smiling. Welcome back to Hogwarts, Lambo. Of course, Lambo crowed. The task you set was successful. Scott glanced around. Let's get out of here and find somewhere we can talk. Lambo agreed. Scott whispered a few instructions, released the bird, and descended from the tower. He walked through the castle and out to a quiet patch of grass by the Quidditch pitch. Lambo flew down and perched in front of him. You can speak now, Scott said. All right. Lambo folded its wings and launched into a report. Katie Shafiq, what a bore. A very proper, old-fashioned witch. Methodical in her work, meticulous in her private life. Watching her was the most tedious thing I've ever done. Sorry to put you through that, Scott said, stroking the bird's feathers. Anything else? Did she contact anyone? She did once, Lambo said, with a hint of frustration. But I couldn't tell who she contacted. You can track messenger owls, right? Scott asked. She didn't use an owl, Lambo said, sounding almost excited. You'll never guess how she sent the message. Scott shook his head. I can't guess. Lambo froze for a beat, then continued. She used a fireplace to send a note, probably through the Flu Network. Scott's eyes narrowed. She works for the Flu Network Administration. If anyone could rig something like that, it would be her. Did she connect it to the regular network? That's the odd part, Lambo said. On her desk, there's a tiny toy fireplace, no bigger than your fist. She put the note in that little thing and it transmitted. So she leveraged her position to hook the toy into the Flu Network, Scott said. He paused. Did you hear where the note went? Yes. When she sent it, she said number 25. Why couldn't you see the note? Scott asked. Because I couldn't get close. Lambo snapped, beating its wings against Scott's arm. But that's not the point. All right, Scott soothed. Let me think. If she put a note through a toy fireplace and said, number 25, maybe she's using those toy fireplaces as a kind of private sub-network, a miniature Flu network, a local area network of sorts. Inside the ministry? He looked at Lambo. You mean her organization might have at least 25 members connected that way? Exactly, Lambo nodded eagerly. Scott reached up and patted the raven. Thank you, Lambo. Keep watching her for me. I don't want the job, Lambo protested. It's boring. I told you, watching her was mind-numbing. You can recruit others, Scott said. You can send messages to other birds and have them take turns. Besides, you might overhear next time if she uses the toy to speak instead of just sending notes. Lambo huffed. Why do I have a friend like you? It grumbled, then sighed. Fine, I'll get some helpers, but only because you asked so nicely. Good, Scott said. I need to know whether Shafiq is acting on Medea's orders or someone else's. Lambo flapped once, then launched into the night. Goodbye, Scott. I'm on it. Scott watched the bird disappear, brushed grass from his robe, and turned back toward the castle. The idea of a mini Flu network made from toy fireplaces intrigued him. It could handle calls and notes in a way that functioned a bit like a private telephone system, nearly a desktop phone for wizards. But it wasn't something any random person could set up. The ability to link a toy fireplace into the Flu network had to depend on insider access. Exactly the kind of access Shafiq would have at the Flu Network Administration. Lost in thought, Scott heard a soft whoosh from above. He looked up just in time to snatch a falling cardboard box out of the air. An owl that had delivered it chirped once and flew on. Scott peered at the plain box, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. He walked back to the grass, sat down, and opened it. Inside lay a small clay toy fireplace, a box of Flu powder, and an envelope. Scott set the fireplace and powder aside and slit the envelope open. Good evening, Scott, the note read in familiar handwriting. Scott's breath caught. He recognized it at once, Medea's handwriting. Lumos. Scott tapped his wand lightly in the air, and a few faint lights, like fireflies, hovered before him. By that dim glow, he began to read the letter carefully. You didn't disappoint me, boy. I appreciate your caution, the note began. It seems I've been tricked, Scott thought. Shafiq hadn't lied. The letter was written to him at Medea's instruction. He hadn't trusted Shafiq, sent a raven to investigate her, a clever construct, and apparently the Philosopher's Stone had already been used. He crushed the rest of his surprise into a quiet sigh. The letter continued. From now on, contact me directly, boy. My small fireplace number is No01. MS. Scott balled the letter and envelope up without expression and tossed them into the air. Incendio, he said. Fire burst from his wand and burned the paper to ash. A small fireplace? Why not just call it a PHS? Scott thought, annoyed at the pretension. He took the tiny fireplace out of the cardboard box, opened the jar of Flu powder, and used the little spoon to drop a pinch into the hearth. A green flame flared to life inside. No, 01, he said. The flame flickered, and then Medea's figure appeared in it. Good evening, boy, she said with a soft chuckle. It seems you've already received the mail I sent you. Good evening, Medea, Scott replied, keeping his voice steady. He said nothing further, Snowy wanting her to state her purpose. Are you puzzled? Medea teased, still laughing. Scott sighed, helpless. I'm just an ordinary fourth-year wizard, he admitted. I don't know why Miss Slytherin would take so much interest in me. Medea laughed with clear delight. How interesting, she said. Scott merely pressed his lips together and waited. Don't overthink it, boy, she went on. I haven't demanded anything of you. Just accept my gifts with a clear conscience. I can't accept them with a clear conscience, Scott thought. Are you so sure I won't tell Dumbledore about this? He asked instead. Of course you wouldn't give up what you've gained or the knowledge you're about to have access to, Medea said with certainty. You're a Ravenclaw. He couldn't deny it. He'd gotten too attached to the treasures, the gifts, the books and notes left in the Chamber of Secrets. He couldn't bear to give them up. I was right, wasn't I? Medea continued. How could a greedy Ravenclaw let go of something it has already grasped? Scott took a slow breath, calmed himself, and asked the only question that mattered. What's your purpose? Besides seeking revival, there must be a larger aim. Medea fell silent for a moment before laughing again. You're perceptive, Scott, but that's too big for you just yet. Focus on your own affairs. What's with that confident tone? Scott thought, bracing himself. From what you say, you already assume I'll join you in the future? My goal is to be free as wind and an eagle. I won't join anyone, he thought stubbornly. You've misunderstood, Medea said more seriously now, the laughter gone from her voice. I have high expectations for you. I haven't treated you like a subordinate. Look further ahead. I believe you'll be my collaborator someday, a true equal. That's hard to believe, Scott said, surprised. I don't have anything that warrants such regard. I think you do, Medea replied, imperious. And that's enough. I trust my judgment. Scott had no answer to that. All right, let's talk about something else, he said finally. Medea's tone lightened. Do you like this little fireplace? She asked. I designed it. I took a trip to the Muggle world. That world has changed so much. Scott blinked. You don't despise Muggles? Why would I? Medea sounded amused. They don't have magic, but they have the same wisdom as wizards. I've seen how they view the world now. It's fascinating. They've already shaken off the intellectual hold that wizard-born knowledge once had over them. Scott found himself looking at her with newfound respect. Wizards and Muggles are perhaps just two people walking different paths, he said. Exactly, Medea agreed. Their perspective is very intriguing. Scott was momentarily at a loss. The ancient Miss Slytherin, who'd slept for 1,000 years, was more in tune with the modern world than his own contemporaries, even Lord Voldemort's blood descendant. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't put words to. That's enough for tonight, Medea said after a pause. I've learned something interesting. Goodbye, Scott. I look forward to our next conversation. With that, her face blew out like a puff of smoke, and the green flame in the tiny fireplace guttered and died. Scott sat for a beat, stunned, then put the fireplace and the flue powder back into the cardboard box. He tied it up with string and slipped it into his deformable lizard skin satchel at his waist. As he stood and stretched, a cold knot formed in his chest. Lambo. He couldn't shake the thought. Had Medea found Lambo? The raven had been transformed using the Philosopher's Stone. The possibility that she or Shafiq could have captured him made his hands clench. Try to look on the bright side, he told himself. Maybe Medea and Shafiq aren't working together. Even if they are, maybe they never found Lambo. They would have done it already if they intended to. Still, worry gnawed at him. By now, Lambo could be far away with no way for Scott to reach him. I hope my friend returns safely, he thought, heavy-hearted. He walked toward Ravenclaw Tower with leaden steps, and then, as if answering his fear, Lambo swooped down from the night sky and landed on his arm. How did you get back, Lambo? Scott asked, relief flooding him as he tightened his fingers around the raven's legs. Lambo blinked, startled to see Scott. Scott? He said, more like a shocked squawk than words. He fluttered and circled Scott once. How did I get here? Did I get hit by the Imperius? He cried in a little panic. Scott signaled him to calm down and gave a small, wry smile. I don't know what's happened either, he admitted after a moment. He glanced up at the stars, then down at his old friend. But this is good. 191. Helena returns to the academy. Time always slipped away unnoticed. One day in early March, after classes had ended, Scott stepped into the Ravenclaw library and froze at a familiar back. Helena? He hurried around and came up behind her. You're back. His tone was a little flat. Helena's presence here meant Ravenclaw had fully returned. Scott knew that no words of his could really comfort her now. Scott? Helena turned. Good afternoon. Long time no see." Scott took in her calm expression and let out a quiet breath of relief. Helena seemed to sense it and couldn't help smiling a little. No need to be nervous. She turned and looked out the window. I was ready for it. Being able to spend that much time with my mother again, hearing her say she never blamed me, that's my good fortune. Scott felt something else too. She'd changed. The whole person, no, the whole ghost, seemed clearer, more translucent. The bitter, resentful air that had clung to her was gone. But could a ghost change? "You're surprised?" Helena asked, and smiled faintly. "Actually, I'm surprised too." Scott nodded. It was strange. Ghosts are traces of the dead left behind. Logically, they shouldn't change. Helena took up the thought. "Usually, if a ghost changes completely, that's when they finally leave." She smiled then, a little proud. "But my mother is the great Ravenclaw. She can do things others think impossible." Hearing that, Scott grew more excited at the idea of having Ravenclaw as his full-time tutor. "You can't wait, can you?" Helena glanced at him. "That's right. You know, that's Ravenclaw," Scott said bluntly. "I've been looking forward to this forever." "Wait until the weekend," Helena said. "Mother said you can only go into her study on weekends." "No problem. The weekend will come soon enough." Suppressing the eagerness in his chest, Scott said goodbye. He was still a little disappointed that he could only enter Helena's study on weekends, but there was no point in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Worrying would only waste time. As he left the common room, voices rose around him. Did it work? No. So hard. Too hard. It must be hard. That's the treasure of Ravenclaw. Students clustered in excited groups. Professor Flitwick had announced the rules for the Ravenclaw diadem. Any Ravenclaw student could apply for a single 10-minute session with the diadem, but only if they met certain conditions. First, applicants had to be in their 4th year or above. Second, they had to give a legitimate reason for needing the diadem. Third, their application needed the signed consent of more than 10 Ravenclaw students. Even meeting those 3 requirements didn't guarantee access. Professor Flitwick's judgment was the final hurdle. After the announcement, enthusiasm in Ravenclaw had exploded. So far, only a handful of students had actually worn the legendary diadem, and only for 10 minutes, but those few had shared glowing reports that made everyone else more eager than ever. Scott! A group of classmates caught him as he passed. Tell us again, is the diadem really that magical? Tell us more. What reason should we give so Flitwick will approve us? How many times had this been? Scott sighed inwardly. As one of the trial wearers Flitwick had exposed, he'd lost count of how many times he'd described the experience. He was tired of it. But when he saw the expectant faces around him, he resigned himself to another retelling and earned a few cheers. Merlin, I'm tired of this, he thought. As if Merlin had heard, Eddie called, Scott, are you here? And pointed toward the portrait hole. Fred and George are waiting for you outside. Okay. Scott escaped his overly curious classmates and pushed through the common room door. Why did you two come? He asked the Weasley twins standing by the window. Is it the map? He added, pulling the Marauder's map from his pouch and handing it to Fred. Sorry, I forgot it. Fred tucked the map away. Listen, George and I have planned a great adventure, he said mysteriously. George nodded. But we both agree we might need your help. Scott examined them. Now, in the middle of term, Hogwarts? You're acting like we haven't explored every inch of this place, Fred said, putting on a wounded expression. The whole castle holds no more secrets for us. George nodded in mock solemnity. So, Fred leaned in. This time we're going into the Forbidden Forest. Scott exhaled. What are you two doing in the Forbidden Forest? Haven't you been there before? We only went to the edge, Fred insisted. This time we're going deep, a real jungle adventure. Scott asked more pointedly, Purpose. I don't think you two would go into the forest for no reason. What are you after? All right. Fred held up his hands. We want to get that car. The flying car Ron lost, George added. It was originally Dad's. He modified it to fly. But Ron flew it to school and got it found out, Fred went on. Dad got punished by the ministry and can't use it anymore. So we figured that car is ours now. We'll find it, fix it, and drive it home at the start of summer vacation. 192. Ginny nods silently. You're going to the Forbidden Forest to find that flying car? Scott shook his head at the Weasleys. Forget it. That car's been abandoned for ages. It's probably too wrecked to drive. No, Fred said, pride coloring his tone. Dad enchanted it. He showed us a few tricks, too. George added, even if it's busted, we can fix it. Scott tried to talk them out of it. The Forbidden Forest is huge. Even with a vehicle, finding one battered old car in there would be nearly impossible. And even if you did find it, what then? Driving it back to the burrow would cause a lot of trouble for your father. Oh, that's where you come in, Fred grinned. You can use arithmancy to work out where it might be, and transfiguration to conjure animals to help us search. George nodded eagerly. As for trouble at home, do you think we're as daft as Ron? The car can turn invisible. Fred lowered his voice conspiratorially. If Dad saw us driving it back, he'd be too chuffed to be cross. He shrugged. Only Mum might be upset. She'd give us a painful ear pull, but it'd pass. Scott stared at them for a moment. You two have thought this through, Fred added, a little too casually. We also know you killed all the acromantulas in the forest, so that place is safe now. George clapped a hand on Scott's shoulder, mock threatening. Don't worry. We won't tell Hagrid. Scott almost caved. He liked the idea of helping, and he liked the twins, but he still played his last card. I'm sorry. I really want to help, but I can't go wandering in the Forbidden Forest. He told them about the last time he'd been in there. There are people who want me dead. They could be watching me. I can't risk leaving Hogwarts. The twins' faces went flat. You should have told us, Fred said. We didn't know. Who are these people? George asked, puzzled. The Yaxley family, Scott said. They looked blank. They're not connected to our family, George added. Fred and George exchanged sympathetic looks. Looks like you'll have to stay in the castle, Fred said sadly. No running about on the holidays, mate. That's the worst, George grumbled. Those families never do anything good. Scott, however, remained firm. You won't be going either, he told them. A lot of people know you two are my friends. I don't want anyone using that against you. The twins deflated completely. Scott felt a small, guilty relief. At least they wouldn't be recklessly wandering into the forest. Then he had an idea. How about we try Axio? Axio? Fred's eyes lit up, then went cautious. Our Axio can't pull something that big. But if we get a lot of people to use it at once, Scott suggested. Good idea, George said. Their faces brightened immediately. It might not work, Fred warned, but it'll be fun. They high-fived and ran off to recruit help. Help us get the word out, Fred called back. Meet at the edge of the forest. Scott smiled and went back to the common room. Half an hour later, he stood with Eddie at the edge of the trees, watching a growing crowd gather. The twins were still absurdly popular in Gryffindor. This is a bit much, isn't it? Eddie murmured. If everyone tries Accio at once, it could just fizzle out from lack of coordination. It's fine, Scott said. He hadn't expected to succeed. He'd suggested the plan mainly to give Fred and George something to occupy their energy. If it failed, at least they'd be kept out of worse trouble. George arrived with Harry, Ron, and Hermione not long after. Fred bounded to the front, clapping his hands for attention. Good evening, everyone, he announced with an exaggerated bow that set half the crowd laughing. Tonight, we perform a feat never before accomplished. Shut up! Angelina stormed forward and shoved him aside, fed up with his grandstanding. Tossing her ponytail, she jabbed a finger toward Oliver Wood. You should lead this. You're the Quidditch captain, more experience. The Gryffindors cheered. Oliver stepped up obediently. Fred, hauled back into the ranks by Angelina, gave an abashed little smile that was unbecomingly tame. Scott exchanged a look with George and winked. George's face fell open. Ron beside him stared in dawning horror. You mean, Fred? He blurted, incredulous. Fred, like that? George exploded into laughter. Of course, he's a lovesick mess around Angelina. That's why he shut up. He howled until the others laughed too. Ron, affronted, refused to believe it. No way. Fred and George are never settling down. They'll be pranksters forever. Hermione scowled at him. Are you saying Fred isn't human? He's not exactly normal, Ron insisted stubbornly, as if his family's opinion settled the matter. Behind him, Ginny stood quietly, listening. When Scott glanced back, she was simply nodding, small and steady. As Scott and the others chatted and laughed, Wood, standing at the front of the crowd, raised his wand. Quiet, everyone, he called. Instant silence fell. To be honest, I don't know why we're doing this either, he added. looking a little helpless. Fred and George asked everyone to help, trying to use Accio together to summon their flying car. He turned his gaze to Harry and Ron in the crowd. It's the one Harry and Ron drove to school last semester. All eyes swung to the two boys. Harry and Ron both shrank back under the attention. All right. I don't know if it'll work, Wood admitted. He looked toward the Forbidden Forest, which was already a black wall. Let's give it a try. Now, first years who haven't learned Accio, step aside. The rest of you, wands out. At Hogwarts, Accio is only taught in 4th year. Students below 4th moved back, and the remaining dozen or so took out their wands and raised them. First years, Wood said, meeting their faces. You still need to be ready. If we actually summon the car, you'll be responsible for casting the levitation charm on it in time. His gaze fell on Harry. Harry, yes? Harry put a hand up, puzzled. You'll be in charge of directing the first years to cast levitation if the car appears. Harry nodded, a little nervous, and drew his wand. Very good. Wood turned to the older students. Concentrate, listen to my command, and prepare to cast the charm. He faced the forest again. All right, 1, 2, 3. Flying car Accio. Everyone called the charm together and swept their wands forward. For a long moment, nothing happened. Did it fail? Someone whispered. George on tiptoe shouted, Again, Wood. All right. Wood raised his wand once more. Prepare. Rumble. Crashing sounds came from deep in the Forbidden Forest. Is it coming? The crowd murmured and craned their necks. Scott blinked. Could it really work? A huge object swayed up out of the trees and tumbled toward them. Is our flying car that big? Fred asked, astonished. It's here, someone cried, and the students cheered. The object drew closer, and Scott's smile vanished into a scowl. Get out of the way, he yelled. You too, he ordered the first years. Forget the levitation charm. Move. Wood bellowed as well. Move, go. People scrambled in a panic. The massive object was almost overhead now. Up close, they could see it. The flying car, after so long in the Forbidden Forest, barely recognizable. Its windows were shattered. Vines clung to the body. Worse, sprawled across the roof was a troll, clutching the car's frame as it tumbled. The headlights flickered on and off, and the engine roared like an enraged beast. What is that? George stammered. It's a troll! Screams cut through the air. That was why Wood had wanted them to scatter. The troll was riding the car, and even if someone managed a levitation charm, it could strike the troll, and the creature's thick skin made charms difficult to effect. Scatter! Scatter! Fred shouted in a way Scott had never heard from him before. Panic tightened Scott's jaw. He couldn't just stand there. If the car smashed down, it could kill or maim people and spray debris everywhere. Besides, summoning the car had been his idea. He swept his wand decisively. 2 streaks of Transfiguration light shot out and struck 2 tall trees in front of them. With a creak and a groan, the trunks twisted like serpents, branches braided and contorted, shaping themselves into 2 enormous wooden hands. The fleeing students froze. Screams and shouts died away. Like hands rising from the earth, the tree-formed palms reached up and caught the falling car and troll, cradling them. Then the hands tightened, gripping the vehicle and its savage passenger. Oh my goodness, someone breathed. Heavy footsteps thundered through the clearing as Hagrid came charging in. What have you lot been up to, you mischievous things? He roared. I saw it all. It was too dangerous, too dangerous. The trapped troll roared and thrashed. Hagrid roared back at it, loud and fierce. Shut up, you monster! Harry, pale-faced, stepped up to Hagrid. I'm all right. Hagrid beamed and gave Harry a hearty pat on the back, sending him stumbling a few steps. Harry managed a weak, "It's nothing. Scott saved us." As if waking from a dream, everyone's attention shifted from the giant wooden hands to Scott. Thank you so much, Scott, George shouted, clapping him on the back with too much force. That was brilliant, mate. That was incredible, Fred added, running over, eyes bright and panic forgotten. 194. Too much consumption, deductions and bonuses. At that moment, Scott felt it keenly. Apart from a few familiar faces, the rest of the crowd was looking at him differently, surprised, incredulous, almost unbelieving. Maybe. He had gone a bit too far, he thought. He staggered a few steps, sank to the ground, and began to gulp in air. What's wrong with you? George, who was nearest, asked, eyes flickering. Scott kept breathing hard. Too much. Exertion, he managed. George crouched beside him, turning his back to the others, and gave Scott a conspicuous wink. Thanks to your sudden burst, Scott, he announced loudly. Oh, you must be exhausted. Scott lay back on the grass. If I had to do it again, he panted, I can't guarantee I'd succeed. How lucky, Fred called out exaggeratedly. Your magic must be depleted. Let's take you to Madame Pomfrey. Concerned faces gathered around. Are you all right, Scott? People asked. Eddie hurried over and, together with George, helped Scott to his feet. Just then, Hagrid shoved a few students aside and stepped forward. Let me take him, he said. I'll bring him to Madame Pomfrey. No need. Scott quickly protested. He shot Eddie a meaningful look. Eddie understood immediately. Right. We'll take him back to the dormitory. Hagrid lowered his head and peered at Scott with obvious worry. Scott met the gaze, then looked away guiltily. I'm fine, he said. Thanks. I just need to rest a bit. He patted Eddie again. Yes. Help me back now. Eddie offered a pretense of support as they started toward the castle. Everyone. Professor McGonagall's indignant voice rang out. Heads turned as she strode up, expression severe, trailed by a cluster of curious students. As she neared, her eyes lifted and took in Scott's handiwork. Who can tell me? Her voice trembled slightly with suppressed anger. What is going on here? The students fell silent, staring at the ground. Hagrid? She demanded, fixing the only adult there with a look. Yes, Professor McGonagall. Hagrid scratched his head. Some mischievous students did things, and that car and that troll flew out of the Forbidden Forest together. He sniffed disapprovingly. Oh, Harry told me. He pointed at Scott. But it was this Ravenclaw student who saved them. Mr. Trollope? Professor McGonagall said, turning to Scott. Scott leaned his full weight on Eddie to look weaker than he was. Eddie, not slender, managed to keep them upright. McGonagall's gaze flicked toward the two trees, oddly shaped like giant hands. You did this? She asked, voice mixed. As your Transfiguration professor, she said, tone shifting, I should praise the exquisite skill of your Transfiguration. But then McGonagall's face hardened. As your deputy headmistress, I must also condemn your recklessness. She fixed Scott with a stern look. Before Hagrid arrived, what exactly did you do? Who can tell me? She scanned the group. Mr. Wood, Miss Johnson, Miss Granger, Mr. Potter? Professor? Fred and George stepped forward. It was the two of us, Professor Weasley, Fred said brazenly. George added, we were conducting a charms experiment. A charms experiment? How interesting. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw collaborating on charms. Why didn't you inform your charms professor? Professor McGonagall asked. The distinctive cold voice of Severus Snape cut in, and both he and Professor Flitwick arrived at once. Is everyone all right? Flitwick asked, peering about with concern. We're fine, Professor Flitwick, Fred said. Our charm experiment was very successful. George chimed in. We called Accio, summoned the car, and it came with a troll perched on it as a bonus. Snape sneered. These reckless students ought to be harshly penalized, he told McGonagall. Only then can we stop them from doing even more outrageous things. Scott caught the triumphant curl of Snape's lip. Lately, Snape had been almost gleeful at the chance to dock points from anyone he could. This incident was a perfect opportunity. Oh, Accio, a joint charm. Flitwick's high voice peeped. The spirit of experimentation is commendable, though a little rash. I will deal with this, McGonagall said firmly, and I will report it to Professor Dumbledore. Snape snorted. Because of this incident, Gryffindor and Ravenclaw should each lose 40 points, he declared. McGonagall's face was unreadable as she looked back toward Scott. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled faintly. Splendid transfiguration, she said. For that, I will award Ravenclaw 50 points. Snape's already unpleasant expression went sourer. Minerva, you cannot praise Mr. Trollope for this, he said through clenched teeth. If you do, he will grow more arrogant and prone to showing off, just like some others. He cast a pointed glance at Harry. Harry's jaw tightened. Ron and Hermione held him back. Had they not, he might have lunged forward in fury. McGonagall ignored Snape's insinuation. I order all students to return to the castle immediately, she said. She glanced up at the troll and the hovering car. From now on, this area will be handled by the professors. 195. Ravenclaw's Basic Course. Scott didn't know how the professors had dealt with the flying car and the troll, but the next day both trees had been restored to their original state. He breathed a quiet sigh of relief. During care of magical creatures, he had asked the Weasley twins about the car, but even they didn't know where their family's flying Ford had gone. Percy wrote home first thing this morning, Fred grumbled. He must have told Mum and Dad about last night. He would, George said. That's Percy. I hope you two don't get a howler like Ron did, Roger added with thinly concealed glee. He hadn't been involved in the incident. He'd been at the classical music club with Caccini the night before. A howler? Scott echoed, puzzled. Fred just grinned, carefree. We're not afraid of howlers, George said. As long as Mum doesn't come herself, Scott laughed. Their skin was a lot thicker than Ron's. Even if she sent one, it wouldn't embarrass you, he said. You understand us, Scott, they said in mock solemnity. Roger stayed silent. Several days passed. When the next weekend came, Scott and Helena went to her study together. You go in by yourself, she told him at the door. Scott nodded and stepped inside. He stood before the landscape painting and spoke politely. Please open the door for me, Helena. The vision of Helena in the painting smiled and inclined her head. A door to an inner room appeared. Scott turned the knob and stepped through. The inner room had changed since his last visit. Where it had once been empty, there now stood a desk and a chair facing a portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw. Scott greeted the portrait as he sat down. Good morning, Professor Ravenclaw. Good morning, Scott, the painted Ravenclaw replied. She looked serious today, the lively glint of her real persona muted in the oil and varnish. Then, let's begin our lesson. Scott agreed without hesitation and took a notebook and pen from his backpack. You are from a Muggle family, Ravenclaw said. Yes, Professor. Then we'll start with the nature of magic. Scott blinked. The topic seemed broad. Do you mean what magic is? Precisely. What do you think magic is? Scott thought for a moment. Magic is using one's will to change the physical world, attacking, healing, defending, or producing effects beyond normal means. It was the neat, fictionalized definition he'd picked up from a lifetime of novels and shows. Ravenclaw listened, nodded, but instead she asked, Do you know why wizards and magical creatures can use magic? I don't, Scott admitted. Ravenclaw's painted face grew thoughtful. Neither do we. Not really. Scott looked surprised. No one knows. No one knows how wizards and magical creatures first came to be, she said. Wizards are anomalies among humans. The ability to use magic seems innate. Hasn't anyone tried to find out? Scott asked. You and other wizards must have researched it. Many have, Ravenclaw said. Her voice turned cold at the next part. There were even those who conducted cruel experiments, trying to find the difference between Muggles and wizards, even attempting to make Muggles into wizards. Many paid for their curiosity with blood, but no one has discovered a definitive answer. She paused, then continued in a softer tone. As for what magic is in practice, among wizards it is the skill of using magical power to accomplish intentions. Scott jotted down a few notes. Ravenclaw watched him for a moment before asking, Do you know why I started with this conversation? He stopped writing and considered. To warn me not to poke around the origins of magic unless I'm prepared? A faint smile touched her painted lips. You are perceptive. Wizards are naturally curious about their origins. Ravenclaws perhaps more so than most. But be careful. The deeper you go, the darker and stranger some paths become. Do not pursue them lightly. Scott nodded. He wasn't planning to hunt for the root of wizardry right now, but her caution registered. Now, she said, about the development of magic. Ravenclaw settled into her portrait as if preparing a lecture. Magic is progressive. At first, magic was instinctive, raw and undirected. You might recall how a child's first surge of magic is uncontrolled. In those eras, you can't even call it refined magic. Over time, techniques were developed, rules observed, and theory formed. Her first lesson read like a compact history of magic. She laid out, in clear measured language, the broad sweep from ancient, crude uses of magic to the increasingly standardized practice of modern times. The further back one went, the simpler and rougher the spells. Closer to the present day, magic became more subtle, codified, and efficient. 1,000 years ago, in Rowena Ravenclaw's own day, the ways of magic were very different from those of the modern wizarding world. The real Rowena Ravenclaw had a comprehensive understanding of the magical system as it developed before she left the world, the portrait said. She passed much of that understanding on. I, this portrait, hold what I was taught. Truly Ravenclaw, Scott thought, more than once, as he listened. The clarity of explanation was unmistakable. "Come back tomorrow morning," Ravenclaw instructed when the hour grew late. "Digest what you learned today. There are 5 more lessons like this." By noon, the first lesson ended. Scott had not learned a new charm or an incantation, but he felt he had gained far more than a single spell. Ravenclaw had given him the framework, the historical and theoretical context that tied disparate spells, traditions, and practices together. Understanding how magic had evolved condensed the accumulated wisdom of countless wizards into a usable map. That systematic perspective, he realized, would make future learning far more efficient. Instead of treating each charm like an isolated skill learned the way he'd learned abilities in his old life, piecemeal and game-like, he could see how different charms connected, why techniques shifted over time, and how to organize his own abilities into a coherent approach. It was a foundation far stronger than the practical, composite spellwork Professor Flitwick taught. With this kind of knowledge, Scott felt he was one step closer to the goals he had set for himself. When Scott left the room of requirement, the Quidditch match had just finished. He was halfway down from the 8th floor to the 4th when he was intercepted by the Weasley twins, who were waving the Marauders map. "Where have you been, Scott?" Fred demanded. "Quick, Eddie's already waiting with a client who wants an arithmancy reading." With that, the twins shepherded him along, one on each side. "Don't I get lunch?" Scott protested loudly. "Oh, don't worry, my dear friend, esteemed Master Trollope," Fred said with a ridiculous flourish. "We'll pack your lunch and bring it to you." George echoed, "Yes, consider it done." They practically dragged him down the stairs to an empty classroom on the 2nd floor. Scott pried himself free, smoothed his robes, and pushed open the door. The 2 people inside turned as one. Eddie could be ignored, but the other face woke a faint memory. A very young Ravenclaw girl, probably a first year. Red hair, green eyes, soft Celtic features, a hint of Weasley resemblance. "Is she family?" Scott murmured to Fred and George. They shook their heads, equally surprised. "Oh, you're finally here, Scott." Eddie stood and stepped forward. "This is Savannah Doherty, first-year Ravenclaw. She needs an arithmancy reading. For the sake of a fellow Ravenclaw, please help her," he added a little too loudly. Scott offered a small nod and looked at the girl. Savannah's expression flickered with panic the instant their eyes met. "Good afternoon. May I call you Savannah?" he asked, smiling. "Of course. Hello, Scott," she answered, then promptly lowered her gaze. Seeing her straight, soft hair, uncommon among the English, something clicked for Scott. The night he'd received Medea's gift, he'd burst from the Chamber of Secrets and found this very girl at the Classical Music Club. He'd asked if Milton was there. "Right, you're in the Classical Music Club. We've met before." He sat opposite her across the large desk. Savannah glanced up once more, then dropped her eyes as if she'd been scalded. Scott paused. He had learned not to take first years lightly after odd encounters like Travers. He carefully reached out with his senses to feel her magical signature. What he felt made his eyebrows lift. Her magic was unusual, utterly different from Travers's violent, bloody malice. Savannah's magic was astonishingly pure, almost plant-like. Wizard's magic, Scott thought, was usually muddied by complex human thoughts and emotions. Animals that approached human intelligence had signatures somewhat similar to wizards. Plants, having no consciousness in the same way, carried the cleanest, most natural magic. A human possessing magic so close to that of plants should have been impossible. Yet here it was, a clarity and purity that didn't belong to an ordinary child. Scott realized he'd never noticed her before because he'd never had reason to look closely. But now he was genuinely surprised. Savannah, clearly uncomfortable under his stare, tucked her head down even further. Scott withdrew his eyes and asked gently, "What do you need arithmancy for, Savannah?" "Yes." She still kept her head bowed and took an old-looking necklace from her pocket, setting it on the table. It was a cord strung with small animal teeth and wooden beads. "I want to know if its original owner is still alive," she said without looking up. "You don't need to tell me where he is, only whether he's alive." Scott hesitated. "Arithmancy can't work with just an object," he said. "There need to be known conditions, dates, names, other facts." "I know," Savannah replied. "Eddie told me that. I prepared everything I could." She produced a folded square of parchment and laid it beside the necklace. Then, glancing nervously at Eddie and the Weasley twins, she murmured, "Could you three step outside, please?" "No problem," Fred said, and George and Eddie fell over themselves agreeing. "We won't disturb you," they chorused, closing the classroom door behind them. Only then did Savannah look up. "Please open it. All the known conditions are inside." Scott unfolded the parchment. A photograph slipped out onto the desk. A boy of about 15 or 16 with his arm around a little girl of 6 or 7. They had the same hair color and similar features. Both were smiling. The older boy wore a plain white shirt, and the worn necklace lay against his chest, a curious, unremarked detail that somehow fit his easy demeanor. "This is my brother, Aaron Dolte," Savannah said quietly. "All the details about him are on the parchment." 197. Let's do business. Scott looked down at the unfurled parchment in his hand. Aaron Dolte, born March 25, 1972, Aries, missing in May 1989. He took his time finishing the little life summary the parchment gave before the disappearance. Then he looked up at Savannah. As her surname implied, she came from a wizarding family in Northern Ireland, one that seemed to be a bit out of the ordinary. Savannah hadn't volunteered details about what made them special, but Scott had noticed clues, the note on the parchment and the oddness of her magic. "Your brother didn't go to Hogwarts?" he asked softly. Savannah shook her head. "No, our family doesn't have the tradition of sending children to Hogwarts. I'm the first." "Were you homeschooled?" Scott pressed. She glanced at him and nodded again, though there was a flicker of hesitation before she did. He didn't push. "All right, I'll try, but I'm not very confident." He drew a fresh sheet of parchment from the lizard skin bag at his waist and took up his pen. He set Savannah's parchment aside and began to write, extracting keywords from it and treating them as conditions. The arithmancy session was quick. The result Scott got was the number 3. He frowned. "That's a bit strange." He closed his eyes and let his senses linger for a moment, then looked at Savannah again. "My conclusion is that your brother is still alive," he said. Joy washed over Savannah's face, but she noticed his expression and asked, slightly afraid, "Is anything wrong?" "Aaron's body, consciousness, and spirit aren't aligned." Scott hesitated, then explained. "The number 3 is telling me his body is in a deep sleep, his consciousness is semi-awake, and his spirit is very active." He'd stared at the result for a long time, almost convinced his arithmancy had misfired. But Savannah's small look of understanding made him realize his reading was probably right. More than that, it suggested she knew more than she'd admitted about Aaron's condition, something she'd kept to herself. It was her private matter, and Scott had no intention of prying. He was, after all, just someone being paid to do a job. "Thank you, Scott." Savannah took 2 galleons from her pocket and set them on the table, then gathered her things. "Goodbye." She met his gaze for a second, flushed, and turned quickly, hurrying out of the empty classroom. Scott raised an eyebrow as her small figure slipped away. He was old enough at heart to understand what the girl's bashfulness likely meant, but she was only 11, still a child, so he shook his head and let it go. Just then, Eddie and the Weasley twins burst in. Eddie was still carrying a bag of food. "How did it?" He set the food down and saw the 2 galleons on the table. His face lit up. "Looks like Miss Doherty was pleased with your arithmancy." He reached for the coins, but Fred's hand was quicker and snatched them first. "Oh, lovely galleons." Fred held them up, admiring them like treasure. "No matter how many times I look at them, they're always so charming." "Hey," Eddie complained, "you're as greedy as the goblins at Gringotts." Fred puffed out his chest and grinned. "Have you ever seen a goblin as tall and handsome as me?" George laughed, and their teasing sent Eddie red. He'd only met Percy and Ron of the Weasleys before, so he didn't have much ammunition in a hand-to-hand handsome contest. Scott stepped in with a helpless smile. "If you want to settle who's the best looking, ask the girls. This isn't going to be decided here." "Of course I'm more handsome than all of you," he thought, munching on a sandwich, but he didn't bother announcing that to the others. "I have an idea," Scott said, swallowing. "We don't need to spend the money right now. These galleons could be our capital. Let's start a small, legitimate business." "Haven't we always been doing business?" Eddie objected. He prided himself on being Ravenclaw's underground merchant, The twins aspired to open a proper Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. They were used to making a profit, but not always by honest means. Scott smirked. Not like you, selling flobberworm mucus as Barufio's brain elixir or repackaging Muggle conditioner as a hair potion. Hey, Eddie protested indignantly. The twins doubled over laughing. I'll admit you're clever, Eddie, Fred said. We only make immature prank items. But they work, George added. Sometimes they're a bit unstable. Scott almost called them out as con artists. Eddie's fake potions were at least harmless. The twins' inventions, while effective, often had unpredictable side effects. Still, young wizards were resilient and eager for danger, so the market existed. My point is, with a bit of capital, we could do something that brings in steady money, Scott continued. Even though he'd only done 2 arithmancy readings and earned 4 galleons in total, 1 galleon went a long way in the wizarding world. I don't have a lot of business experience, so I'd like you 3 to think about what we could do. If you agree, we can start taking 2 more clients per session beginning next week. Eddie and the twins exchanged excited looks. No problem, they said in unison, already imagining the possibilities. 198. Second class. Milton's Troubles. The next morning, Scott returned to Helena's study for his second lesson with Professor Ravenclaw. The previous day, she had given him a broad overview of how magic developed. Today's lesson was meant to teach him to see modern magic as an integrated system. It still felt impossible that Ravenclaw, a witch who had lived more than 1,000 years ago, could command so much of today's magic. Her consciousness was preserved in a portrait, and she only fully woke when Helena opened the study door. Yet in that short time, the founder had updated her painted mind, absorbing a millennium of knowledge with astonishing speed. Scott couldn't help wondering what kind of learning this was. What sort of magical method let someone pull together so much information so quickly? Was there some secret technique of instant enlightenment he could learn? And for the founders, was their death ever really final if they could persist like this? His thoughts drifted, and Ravenclaw saw it immediately. She reprimanded him, sharp but fair. Ravenclaw's students are quick of mind, but too often they reach for more than they can carry. Remember, every path is walked one step at a time. Scott obediently brought himself back to attention. He knew how lucky he was to be taught by Ravenclaw at all. By noon, the lesson on the structure of modern magic had ended, and Scott was once again struck by how superb a teacher she was. To condense a vast, complex subject into a single morning's lecture, clear, well-organized, and practical, was remarkable. Before he left, Scott seized the chance to ask about Savannah, the girl he'd met the day before, whose magic had struck him as unusual. Ravenclaw listened, nodded, and then smiled faintly. "I know of what you speak," she said. "Her magic is not common." "She practices an ancient form of magic?" Scott asked. "Indeed, it descends from the Druids of the Celts," Ravenclaw replied. "I did not expect such a tradition to still have living practitioners." Scott felt his prior guesses confirmed, but asked more. "How does such pure magic arise? Isn't it unsuited to most charms?" "It is the Druids' legacy," Ravenclaw said, eyes distant. "They sought communion with nature. The stronger a Druid's attunement, the purer their magic becomes. Their training is complex and usually begins in childhood. The techniques are not something you can pick up quickly." "And their spell casting?" Scott pressed. "They have their own system. They can perform charms, but those effects are often diminished when translated into Druidic methods." Ravenclaw waved a hand. "Enough for now. This will be covered in later lessons. Go on. Your day awaits." Scott swallowed his remaining questions, bowed to the portrait, and left the study. By the time he reached the Great Hall, lunch was underway. He found a seat at the Ravenclaw table and ate quietly until Milton, late as usual, sat down beside him. Scott didn't notice Milton's mood at first, but the boy's reddened eyes and the way he mechanically stuffed food into his mouth made it clear something was wrong. After a while, Scott suggested, "Do you want to go for a walk by the Black Lake?" Milton nodded, and they left the hall. He was silent as they walked. Scott picked up a few flat stones and began skipping them across the water's surface, giving his friend space. Milton watched the ripples, then sat on a nearby rock. "I got a letter," he said finally. "Dad's getting married." Scott's hand paused mid-skip. He didn't know what to say. Milton went on in a low, self-mocking voice. I kept making excuses for him before. I told myself maybe he'd just lose himself for a while and then come back. I imagined he'd change his mind, bring Mom back, and things would be like before. His voice broke. He swore, you know? When he married Mom against Grandpa's wishes, he swore he'd never regret it. We were ostracized at Grandpa's house, and he still said he wouldn't regret it. It's so disappointing, Milton said, the anger bleeding into pain. He can't even stay true to the thing he fought for. Scott put a hand on his shoulder. There was nothing that would make the loss less real. This was a wound Milton had to feel through. Still, he tried to offer a different perspective. Look on the bright side, Scott said gently. At least your mother found a way out. She's free from being trapped, and maybe she can chase the life she wanted. Milton nodded hard. She's gone, thank goodness. I hope she never comes back. I hope she gets to do what she dreamed of. Scott withdrew his hand and asked, Do you know who your father's marrying? I do, Milton said. They've been seeing each other for a while. He's marrying a pure-blood widow, Mrs. Zabini. Scott stared. The stone in his hand slipped and clattered to the ground. 199. Bait. Medea weaves a web. Mrs. Zabini? Scott stared at Milton, stunned. He had not expected Mr. Greaves to be involved with a woman known as the infamous Black Widow of the British magical world. That lady, he began hesitantly. Even I, a Muggle-born, have heard of her reputation. Don't you? Don't you know what people say? I know the rumors. Milton's voice was rough. They say she's been widowed 6 times, and each husband left her a fortune. So, Scott looked at him. Shouldn't you be worried about your father's safety? Milton's face went flat. What good does knowing do? My grandfather knew, my father knew, and they don't care. Scott felt helpless. Is it really that they'd risk someone's life just to marry into a true pure-blood family? My grandfather only sees the advantages of a pure-blood marriage, Milton said with another bitter laugh. And that woman has wealth and connections most people dream of. And my father, Milton shook his head. He's completely lost his head. He actually thinks he's won her love. Scott wanted to ask where Mr. Greaves's confidence came from, but he also knew that nothing would sway a man who'd already fallen in love or delusion. A man who had lost his head would never admit he couldn't control her. Still, something about the situation felt off to Scott. He asked quietly, One more thing, could it be that your family is actually very wealthy? Milton shook his head. He understood Scott's point. Honestly, I don't understand why she'd choose my father. She's from a pure-blood line and overloaded with money. He snorted. But that's the reason my father thinks he's so special. The idea that Mr. Greaves might believe there was nothing worth targeting in his own family surprised Scott. He asked softly, What do you plan to do? And isn't her son at Hogwarts, second-year Slytherin? Just thinking about it made Scott uneasy for Milton's sake. Milton was quiet for a long time, then finally shrugged, blank-faced. I don't know. He took a deep breath and stared at the sky. Right now, there's nothing I can do. I have no reason to stop my father marrying her. Scott knew that was true. As a son, Milton had no legitimate grounds to forbid his father's remarriage. He couldn't stop it, and Scott had no practical way to help. The only thing he could offer was an ear. Or, Scott's thoughts shifted. Maybe he could do more. He hesitated to say anything out loud, unsure. They sat in silence for a while. After a long pause, Milton forced a small smile. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for listening. I feel better. You don't have to thank me, Scott said. I just walked with you. That's enough. Milton waved him off. You go on. I remember you have Professor Babbling's class on Sunday afternoons. You sure you're all right? Scott asked. I'm sure. Milton met his gaze, and Scott let himself believe it. After a moment, he added, Milton, you'll be an adult in 3 years. That actually made Milton smile. I know, he said. I've always thought I'd leave that family. It just might happen sooner than I thought. Relieved that Milton seemed steadier, Scott left. Later that day, after Ancient Runes, Scott returned straight to the dormitory. His roommates were out. He shut the door, took the cardboard box Medea had sent from his bag, and placed it on the table. The whole business between Mrs. Zabini and Mr. Greaves felt odd to him. He could have asked Lambeau to investigate, but Lambeau's methods, surveillance and eavesdropping, would take time and might come up empty. There was, however, another option sitting on his table. Scott opened the box and lifted out the small fireplace the messenger had delivered. A thought came to him, sharp and unwelcome. Why would Medea hand him access to her intelligence network? Perhaps it was a deliberate bait. If he began using her network, he might quickly become dependent on it. Dependency would lure him to use it more, and with each use he'd expose his own plans and information to her. Over time, he would sink deeper into the web she'd woven and find it hard to break free. His hand paused over the jar of flu powder. If he only asked why Mrs. Zabini was marrying Mr. Greaves, he wouldn't reveal any of his own motives. Yet Scott hesitated. The network could be too useful. If he never tried it, he could resist later temptation. If he tasted how helpful it was, he wasn't sure he could refuse again. After a long, tense moment, he snapped the flu jar shut. He put the tiny fireplace back into the box, stuffed the box into the warped lizard skin bag, and hurried from the dormitory. He went straight to the edge of the forbidden forest and blew a sharp whistle. Not long after, Lambo emerged from the trees. Since gaining higher intelligence, Lambo no longer wanted to sit in the dormitory. When idle, it preferred the safety of the forest. Scott let the creature land on his arm and smoothed its wings. He gave a few instructions, then freed his raven to fly out and look for clues. He watched the bird go and hoped it would return with something useful. After that day, Milton stayed outwardly the same, but adjusted his habits. He cut back on piano practice and dedicated more time to studying and improving his magic, very deliberately working to get stronger. He never brought up his father's remarriage again, and Scott did not press the issue either. For now, everything would wait until Lambo and the Raven came back with news. 200. Surprising and even more surprising, that morning in the Great Hall, a flock of owls swept over the students, dropping letters and packages onto the tables and causing a commotion. Scott casually used a book to swat a few loose feathers aside, then returned to his meal. Neville suddenly came up behind him. "Good morning, Scott," Neville said softly, shy and hesitant. "Good morning, Neville." Scott turned to look at him. "I thought you'd be more confident." Neville, round-faced and awkward, blinked. I'll try my best." Scott smiled. "Relax, I was only teasing." Neville nodded, but there was a new determination in his eyes. Scott noticed the change immediately. "Did you come to see me about something?" "I told my grandmother about it, and she wanted to thank you." Neville reached into the leather bag he'd been holding and pushed it towards Scott. "This is her thank you gift. You must take it." "A thank you gift?" Scott was surprised. "You already paid, Neville." "That was for arithmancy." Neville urged the leather bag forward. "But you should accept this." "All right." Scott stopped being polite and took the bag. "Please thank Mrs. Longbottom for me." Neville smiled shyly, then went back to the Gryffindor table. Eddie, who sat next to Scott, leaned over to look. "A thank you gift? What is it?" Scott weighed the bag. Something inside gave a crisp, pleasant clink. Eddie's eyes widened. "Oh, galleons! Quick, see how many." Eddie pressed. Scott opened the bag and peeked inside. "Looks like more than 20. "Mrs. Longbottom is really generous," Eddie said, clearly envious. Scott flipped his hand and tucked the purse into the lizard skin pouch at his waist. "By the way," he asked Eddie, "have you decided what kind of business we're going to do?" Eddie glanced toward Scott's waist, then whispered, "My idea is we smuggle goods from Hogsmeade to sell at Hogwarts. The twins know some secret passages." He shrugged. "But the twins want us to use the money to buy raw materials so they can make more popular joke items." Scott wasn't surprised. Eddie preferred working alone. The twins were used to collaborating. They would struggle to reach a consensus. Scott wasn't in a hurry. "Don't rush. Let me know when you decide." Eddie sounded surprised. "Aren't you the one deciding? You're putting up most of the capital." "No." Scott shook his head decisively. "I don't understand business. I'm just a shareholder. You two run it." He intended to be a hands-off boss from the start. After finishing his meal, Scott wiped his mouth, patted Eddie's shoulder, and stood. "Do well, Eddie. I'm waiting for good news." He gathered his books and went to class. At noon, Lambo, sent earlier to investigate Mrs. Zabini, returned to Hogwarts. After lunch, Scott slipped out alone to the edge of the forbidden forest. He cast a charm to dampen sound and checked in with Lambo. The answer surprised him. "Mrs. Zabini has a small fireplace, too," Lambo reported, sounding smug. "She was talking to the toy fireplace." Toy fireplace, Scott repeated, heart quickening. Originally, she only meant to have Mr. Graves as a lover for a while, Lambeau continued. She chose to marry him because Medea suggested it. Scott stared. That was odd. Rumors painted Mrs. Zabini as a shrewd, pure-blood witch. Mr. Graves, from a newly rising wizarding family, was only an ordinary ministry employee, hardly the kind of prize someone like Mrs. Zabini would marry for status. In Scott's mind, there were only two logical reasons she might: money or real affection. Mrs. Zabini's scheming nature made the first far more likely, yet the Graves family didn't seem to have anything worth scheming over. Milton knew of no family fortune. Could she have married for love? Milton didn't believe it, and Scott found the whole thing suspicious. Out of both sympathy for Milton and his own curiosity, Scott had asked Lambeau to look into it. The result, Mrs. Zabini's marriage arranged at Medea's suggestion, was stranger than strange, and yet it was the only explanation that made sense. Why would Medea push them to marry? What's in it for her? Scott demanded. I don't know, Lambeau snapped. Look, Scott, don't worry about it. I don't meddle in other crows' nests. I never meant to meddle, Scott said. His head throbbed from Lambeau's tone. I only wanted to warn Milton, to prepare him. I didn't expect. Caw, caw, Lambeau mocked. Forget it. This isn't something to manage right now. Scott decided quickly. Milton had already begun to detach himself from the Graves family. The news shouldn't do more than hurt him emotionally. In any case, good luck, Mr. Graves, Scott muttered. He dispelled the silencing charm, said goodbye to Lambeau, and walked out of the forest. Near the edge, he heard footsteps behind him. For a moment, he felt even more astonished than before. He hadn't sensed anyone approach. Impossible. He turned and saw a girl emerging from the trees, leaves caught in her hair. Good afternoon, Savannah, he said. He felt the strange, pure kind of magic around her, as if it blended with the very air and plants. For a moment, Scott's surprise softened into understanding. Is this the unique magic of a druid? Sorry, dear readers. I'm a bit stuck today, writing and deleting, and managed only 2 updates. I'll sort out the next plot overnight and move the timeline into the next school year as soon as possible. I'll make it up with 4 updates tomorrow. Please continue to support me. Thank you very much.